In this video, we're going to talk about time series forecasting. Now, what is time series forecasting? Basically, it's a statistical technique, and there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but it's based on looking at historical data for whether it be revenue or units of demand or stock prices or whatever you want to look at, weather, but it's looking at some numerical variable and it's looking at sequential time-ordered historical data. So, for example, you could have daily data, monthly data, quarterly data. It could be going back a month, 6 months, 5 years, even more. And based on that, you're making a prediction as to what the future forecast for that variable will be. So let's say in this example, this is our business, these are revenue numbers, and these are 4 different regions. So we can do forecasting overall at the business level. We can also do it broken up by region, by product group, by customer type, all different ways. In this case, we're looking at it by region. And let's say we have 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. So we have 4 years of historical data. And we're at the beginning of 2022, and we want to make a time series forecast for 2022. And we have quarterly data. So you'll see there's 4 points for each year. What the models do is they train the model on roughly 75 to 80% of the historical data. So in this case, since we have 4 years of history, it takes the first 3 years, 2018 through 2020, and trains the model on that. And by train the model, it basically goes through the data looking for patterns and trying to understand when it comes to predicting revenue. What other columns within our data set are most highly associated with revenue? So that's the training set. Then it makes predictions on historical data on the most recent 20 to 25%. So in this case, it trained the model on the first 3 years, and then it makes predictions on the final year of our historical data, because remember, we're running this at the beginning of 2022. And because that 20 to 25% of data was not used to actually train the model, it's a really good indication of how the model should perform making forecasts going forward. And then the final step is we want to make predictions for the next 4 quarters of 2022 and into 2023. So this is what we call the time series forecast portion. Now, how do we do this within the Sway AI platform? So once we've downloaded our data set here, you'll see if we click on preview data, the one important thing for any time series modeling, and there's a lot of different techniques you can use, but in every case, you need a date column. So sometimes you'll see the dates are going across, they're different columns, and in that case, we have to use something called an unpivot node. But in this case, since all our dates are in one column, we don't need to use that unpivot node. But what we do want to identify is a couple things. This is our date column. It's a daily data, so it's not monthly or quarterly or annual, it's daily data. And we have a couple numerical fields. We have revenue and we have units purchased. So we could run the forecast on either or both of these. In this example, let's do it on revenue. And then how do we want to group our forecast? We want it to be overall for the business. So on that line graph I showed, we would just have one line. Or in this case, we did it by region. So we have a forecast for each region. So we can group our forecast by different things, maybe by a geographic region, maybe by a product group, maybe by a customer type, anything like that. So now that we've looked at our data, there's a few different nodes that are pretty common within the Sway platform. First is if our date is not in a date time format, we have to convert it from string to date time. Sometimes when we read it in as a CSV file, it's in a string format, so we have to convert it to date time. The second is define time series column. So this is where we tell our model, what is it that we're trying to predict? Right? So in this case, our time series column is purchase date, it's daily data, and we're trying to predict revenue at these groups, right? So we're trying to predict it by customer number, by product group, and by region. So that's what we call the defined time series column. This is always mandatory. It's the first or second step in this case within the time series models on the Sway platform. Now, downsample is where, in this case, we have daily data, but we want to make our time series forecast at the quarterly level. So we can downsample or aggregate the data from daily data down to a quarterly level to make projections going forward. So once we've downsampled our data, the next node I want to briefly cover is time series imputation. And this is quite simply because a lot of times machine learning models do not work as well if you have missing data. So in this case, you might have revenue data for certain product groups or regions or customer types, for a particular time period, let's say the first quarter of 2022, but you don't have it for others. So in this case, you can impute, basically fill in those missing values for those products, et cetera, with zeros. Because maybe it was a new product or maybe it was a discontinued product, but for whatever reason, that particular time period didn't have any data. So rather than eliminating those rows from the data set before we model, we can just impute or replace those nulls with zeros. Time Featurizer is a way to create up to a dozen new features or columns that could potentially be predictive of future revenue trends based on the date that we already have in our data set. So we have a date, let's say 1/1/23. This tells us, breaks it up into the month, the day, the year. It tells us if it was a weekday or a weekend. It tells us what day of the month was it, what week of the quarter was it, what quarter of the year was it, all these fields or features or new columns based on the date field. And you never know what's going to be most predictive of your target variable, what you're trying to predict, which is future revenue trends in this case. So Time Featurizer is a great way to engineer, as we call it, some new features, feature engineering. And then the last thing is this thing we call lag feature, this node. And basically this means how far back do you want to go? And again, we're adding new columns. So rather than just saying we have historical timestamps or dates for revenue, this is saying for a particular quarter, once we've downsampled it to quarterly, for example, what was the revenue 1 quarter ago? That's considered a lag of 1. What was the revenue 2 quarters ago? That's considered a lag of 2. So it's adding new columns, which are essentially historical timestamps on your data. And we might find that the best predictor of future revenue is the most recent revenue, which was lag 1, or we might find that it was a year ago, which would be lag 4 quarters ago. So these are some of the most common nodes that you'll want to consider using in terms of your data prep for time series. And then the last step will be to actually pick a model itself to train. And you'll see here, the platform already knows that these are all time series forecasting models specific, so they're not classification or regression. And there's over a dozen different models that we can use. And you just select one and train the model, and then you can build dashboards and create inferences, which are predictions of future data. So I hope that helps. We'll cover the models in more detail, and we'll cover each of these nodes in more detail in a separate video. But for now, this is an overview of time series forecasting and how you might want to do it in the Sway AI platform. Thank you.